Hey, deserving listeners, I have a question for you. Are you a perfectionist? Or do you know someone who is a perfectionist? If so, I have some questions for you. As I ask these questions, think about yourself or this other person. Are you or this other person often stressed out about things being perfect? Do you or this other person struggle with procrastination? Do you have trouble delegating tasks? Do you get upset when people don't follow the rules as you see them? Do people say you work too much? Do you obsess about your body in some way? Do people say you can be stubborn? Are you obsessed with learning? Are you often worried about things being disorderly? Do you have trouble throwing things away because you worry you might need it later? Or does this other person do that? Do people say that you have type A personality? Do people say that you're overly opinionated? Is it hard for you to take a vacation and just chill? Do you worry about the future? Do people say you have unrealistic standards for yourself or other people? Are you particularly self-critical? If you said yes to a number of these for yourself or this other person, this podcast might be very helpful for you. I'm not saying you have OCPD or this other person does, but it's worth taking a look at. So this was a very requested deep dive and has been for a long time. People for years have been asking me to do a deep dive on obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, which was confusing to me. But then after doing that, so what I did is I actually recently sent a survey on the Facebook fan page and on Discord asking people to vote on what deep dive personality disorder wise I should do next. And obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which I will call OCPD from now on because it's shorter, was the most requested deep dive, which was interesting to me. But when I did the deep dive, I discovered why. The discoveries, I made a number of discoveries during this deep dive, and I thank y'all for asking me to do this, because there are a lot of OCPD is, I think, a very important construct within psychology and psychotherapy that I don't think is discussed enough. And maybe it is discussed a lot, but it's just not in my circle. I mean, of course, other personality disorders are discussed way more often. Borderline, narcissism, psychopathy, antisocial, these things are much likely discussed. But I discovered that OCPD is the most common personality disorder in the United States. So get that OCPD is the most common personality disorder in the United States. Yet, how often do you hear people talking about it? I mean, you hear people talking about it, but not very often, not as, not commensurate with how frequent it is. And there's a lot of suffering around OCPD, by the way. There's a pretty good chance that if you had a difficult partner or a difficult parent, that person had OCPD as at least part of their presentation, because it can cause a lot of relationship problems. The other thing that I discovered was that many people, myself, I discovered, and others, have traits of OCPD. The other thing to note is that OCPD is not like OCD. It's not like obsessive compulsive disorder. It's often confused because they have a very similar name. One's called obsessive compulsive disorder, and the other one is called obsessive compulsive personality disorder. And you would think that they're very similar, but in fact, they're, in my mind, extremely different. And I'll get into that more later. In fact, I wish OCPD was called something different. I wish it was called perfectionistic personality disorder, because I think that gets at the core much more easily. But we have this old language, the borderline personality disorder. Why is it called borderline? Well, I could tell you why. It's not. Well, I'll tell you why. It's because they observed people in the early 20th century who seemed, quote unquote, borderline psychotic, meaning that their ideas about what was going on in other people's minds was extremely distorted. And so they labeled them, they kind of seem psychotic. So they're borderline psychotic. But if I were to name borderline personality disorder, I wouldn't call them borderline psychotics. I would call them relationally traumatized regarding abandonment. So I might call it like abandonment personality disorder or something, or betrayal personality disorder. Anyway, so I would have called OCPD perfectionistic personality disorder. The other thing I discovered about OCPD is that there's a lot of talk on the internet, and there's a lot of people talking about OCPD is a very positive thing. And there are some positives, which I'll get into later. But by definition, OCPD causes a lot of problems internally and externally. The other thing that I read about, and I sort of knew this already, is that it's been around since Freud and Genet, meaning that we have over 100 years of literature and research around OCPD, and it's been included in all the DSMs. There's not a lot of disorders, particularly the personality disorders, that have been around through all the iterations of the DSM, which I'll get into later, which really points to just how common it is. Another thing I learned that I didn't know, actually, is that OCPD is confused with autism, and it can be comorbid, which I'll get into later. The other thing that I discovered is that there are distinct types of OCPD, and I think this is where the real understanding of OCPD comes into play, is when you really elucidate the different types of OCPD, then I feel like you understand OCPD. And I spent a lot of time thinking about all the people that I thought might have suffered from OCPD among clients that I've treated and among people in my life, and categorize them, because I feel like when you just read about OCPD on the internet, it's hard to really know how it manifests, because it can manifest in very different ways, but the underlying personality problem is the same. The distortion is the same. The other thing I discovered is that I am definitely on the spectrum of OCPD, which probably does not surprise a lot of you. And I'm ashamed. I mean, I'm not terribly ashamed, but I'm humiliated that I've never thought about that. I've never known. I've been a therapist for 25 years. I've been in therapy for a long time. I've been a professor for 20 some years. I've been a podcaster for 13 plus years. Personality disorders are something that I think about often. I consider myself an expert in personality disorders, maybe some more than others. But the fact that it's taken me until I'm 51 years old to say, I'm on the OCPD spectrum. Like, that really points to one, just how much there is to learn, and how much I still have to learn, and how little I know. And yeah, there's just so much to learn. There's just so many niches and crannies. What's the phrase? There's so many little pockets and corners of psychology and psychotherapy that to fully understand it, you have to really go into it. You can't just read the tagline, because I've read the tagline. I've read the symptoms in the DSM. I've read research on OCPD, but I didn't really get it. You know, which makes total sense. I talk about this all the time. Like, people read the symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder on the internet and they feel like they understand it. No, you have to treat it. People think they understand PTSD or trauma or complex PTSD. No, you don't understand it unless you really go into it, or you lived with it, or you had someone in your life. And so, yeah, all of my talk about being high in the conscientious scale, my obsession with time management, my obsession with being on time, my moralistic rants of being on a soapbox are all right down the middle OCPD. Now, I will say that I'm mild, not because I'm being narcissistic or something, but it doesn't, and I'll get into it later, it doesn't cause a lot of suffering. And there's some minor suffering, I suppose, but not tremendous, you know. So there are, you know, like I was saying earlier, some positives that you can, if you're mild on the spectrum, and that's been known for decades. For decades, it's been understood that if you're mild in the OCPD spectrum, it actually can be a plus in your life. So as an example of this, when I was developing my notes, I had 550, I always use Microsoft Word for my notes. I'm just used to Microsoft Word. And I had 550 pages of notes on OCPD. And I use this bullet point system. I love bullet points for my notes. Whenever I'm doing an episode, if you don't know, I'm always reading my notes, and they're always this very particular sort of bullet point system that I like. And as I was developing my 550 pages of notes, the bullet point system in Microsoft Word got wonky. If you've ever used Word, you know I'm sure if you use bullet points, you understand it. Like the indents will get kind of weird, or the bullet point, it won't be uniform, and it got out of whack. And I think a lot of people would have just let it go because to correct it would have been too hard. But for me, it was such an aggravant on my OCPD because it wasn't orderly. It wasn't quote unquote perfect. There were flaws that were kind of eating away at me, that I actually imported line by line my 550 pages of notes into a new Word doc. And it took a long time. And I as I'm doing it, I'm like, wow, this is kind of OCPD of me. Like I can't deal, and I've always been this way. I've done this with many of Deep Dive, many episode of this podcast has a part of the development of my knowledge and of the notes has been making sure that the bullet point system looks just right to me, if that makes any sense. Also, I want to say that all my previous discussions about OCPD, I haven't talked about very often, I've talked about a couple times, have not been very good. And although they're not wrong, they're not really getting to the point. And so if you ever go back and listen to an episode, or I do a rerun and I discuss OCPD and the date of the rerun predates January of 2022, which is now, then disregard it because it doesn't represent how I see it today. So in this episode, I'm going to go over the symptoms as I see them, because when you, again, read the DSM or you read online or even in the clinical literature, the summaries of OCPD, it's hard to really get a feel for what it's really like. And so I spent a lot of time developing my own descriptive symptom list with examples to really flesh it out. I'm going to provide some online tests so you can play along and maybe get an idea as to whether or not you should take a look at yourself. As I said earlier, I'm going to go into types. And like I said, this is where it really becomes comprehensible with the examples. I'm going to go into the DSM and the various iterations. I'm going to provide differentials, of which there are many, and provide comorbidities, of which there are many. The prevalence, the causes, what exactly causes OCPD. I'm going to go into the history a little bit, back to Freud and Genet. And I'm going to talk about the treatment, what it's like to treat, the transference, countertransference, how to provide corrective experiences, what types of corrective experiences you need to provide. And I'm going to analyze myself. So that's what we're going to do. This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. This episode is just for patrons of the podcast. So if you want to hear this whole episode, you have to become a patron by going to patreon.com and becoming a patron of this podcast, and you'll get access to the whole episode. I'm guessing this episode is going to be pretty long. I'm going to do a follow-up too, as well, by the way. If you're a patron and you listen to this and it spurs some thoughts, or you think about yourself or someone, particularly if you have yourself as an example or someone that you know, please email in, because I want to do a follow-up. That's kind of my format now, is I do the deep dive, and then y'all write in and I do a follow-up to it to kind of refine the understanding of it, because it's all in the examples. That's when you really understand personality disorders. And it also furthers my understanding, as I think about your examples and I think about your questions, I think about maybe even your, the problems you have with what I'm saying or something, or how it contradicts your experience. It definitely helps to refine my conceptualization of it, which is helpful for me as a podcaster, professor, therapist. So anyway, if you become a patron, you'll get access to this deep dive of, I think it'll be a couple episodes, maybe 2, maybe 3. And then the follow-up episodes will also be for patrons only. But before doing that, I want to give an example. And I pulled this example from Reddit. And I thought about the ethics of reading someone's post, because, someone's talking about themselves on Reddit. And I thought, is that ethical to read someone's Reddit post? But I looked it up, and the general consensus is it's not an ethical violation to read someone's Reddit post, because they've already posted it for the entire planet to read. And it is anonymized because the username doesn't identify who they are. And as long as I don't do any extra work, or I don't act irresponsibly in a way that would identify this person, then there's not really a possibility of harm happening to this person. Plus, again, they posted this for the entire world to see anyway. But it just felt a little invasive to read someone's post because it's so personal. But again, they posted it on the internet. So I'm going to read this one because I feel like this Reddit post kind of gets to the core experience of a lot of people with OCPD. Not everyone, but a lot of people. So I'm going to read it. I've been a perfectionist for as long as I can remember. I used to play tennis as a kid, and every time I hit the ball out or in the net, it triggered the worst kind of feeling you could ever imagine. Something akin to a knife stabbing me in the gut. It just brings such terrible anguish to me that I would do anything to not feel that feeling. 15 years later, and I still struggle immensely with perfectionism every day. Perfectionism is negatively affecting my life in every way, shape, and form. It causes me to experience pretty rampant anxiety on a day-to-day basis, almost to the point where I find life to just be draining and exhausting. I do have a therapist I've been seeing weekly for 2 years, as well as a psychiatrist whom I meet with every so often. My family has told me repeatedly that there are worse things to be than a perfectionist, which I can only chalk up to the fact that they only see the good things that I want them to see about my perfectionism. For instance, I do really well in school and I get pretty decent grades. Only problem is that it's at the expense of my mental health, as I am a nervous wreck for every assignment. Being assigned to the assignment, actually doing it, then turning it in and waiting to see the grade, I am perfectionistic about the entire process. End of Reddit post. Yeah, so again, not everyone with OCPD would be able to directly relate to this, but I feel like it encapsulates the general experience. The themes here are perfectionism, being plagued with it, the visceral feeling of, like a knife. Not everyone feels this, but I think it is a traumatic kind of response, kind of like a complex PTSD response that people have to being imperfect, whether it's with tennis or a school assignment or orderliness in the house or cleanliness in the house or a relationship, or I don't know. The preoccupation is I must be perfect, I must be flawless, or this must be or these other people must be perfect. And what the person is running away from is that visceral pain of, oh my God, it has a flaw. Oh my God, it's not orderly. Oh my God, it's not right. There's something, the mild version of it for me was those bullet points. I'm looking at the bullet points and it doesn't feel right in my body. The fact that it's like I said, for some people, they wouldn't have even noticed that the indents were different among the bullet points. But for me, it feels bad in my body. And so if I ramped that up times 10, there's a lot of negativity. There's a lot of bad feelings there, right? Because there's a lot of disorder in the world. There's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of things that you can't make perfect all the time. And so, and when I get into the types, you'll see how it manifests differently, because it can manifest in hoarding. It can manifest in body concerns, like with eating or working out, this kind of thing. It can manifest in workaholism or being self-righteous, being very opinionated. It can involve in procrastination and self-sabotage, and all or nothing lifestyle where you spend a week doing everything just perfect and then another week doing everything the opposite of that. There's a lot of different presentations, but the core of it, I think, is described in this Reddit post. But anyway, so become a patron and you'll hear the series of episodes that go into obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, and you'll hear the follow-ups to the episode as well. So do it now and become the perfect listener to this podcast. Just joking.